So let's say I just noticed somebody on my team who is obviously less productive and even more so now remote. And now I'm wondering in my head, are they just playing more video games? Is something else going on? I
Yep.
want to ask, but I have no idea how to approach this conversation. And in fact, like I'm actually pretty fearful of giving direct feedback like that. What would you
Right.
do? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I know we'll get into the model and some of the structure behind this later, but the key thing to remember, there's two parts to this. One is, as human beings, there's two things that we do, one that we're really good at and one that we're really awful at. The thing that we're really good at is sensing or noticing that something is off. Our powers of observation are incredibly attuned, right? So we sense, even with very minimal data, something's off. Something's going off with this person. So in this example, like they're less productive. The other thing that we do, which we're awful at, is we assume we know why. We make a conclusion. Well, I know why they're being less productive. It's because they're live streaming or they're playing video games or whatever. And all of our problems as managers, or 99% of our problems as managers when it comes to feedback and coaching, is merging those two things instead of separating them. So instead of merging them, instead of saying, well, that person's being less productive and it's because they're playing video games, it's, oh, that person seems to be less productive. I wonder why. That's the whole thing, right? It sounds easy. It's very difficult to do because that power of making assumptions and making theories and making stories, we have such a powerful ability to do that, and we mostly use it to bad ends. So in that example, I had an example very much like that recently. And so I said to the manager, I said, okay, so what can you do about it? And he said, well, I can't say anything about that. And I said, well, wait a second. You can't say anything about your theory that he's playing video games, but that doesn't mean you can't say nothing, right? And he's like, well, I guess I could talk about the performance. Okay, great. What could you say about the performance? Well, I guess I could say that I've noticed a difference between when we were in the office, you were performing at a pretty high level, and now that we've been remote, it's been not as good. And I said, great. So can you say that? And that was it. And I said, so that's all you want to say, just that. Maybe you're right. Maybe he is playing video games, but maybe there's a whole other reason that you don't know of. And so he went and did that, and he separated the observation from the conclusion, right? He made the observation, and then he slacked me later that day. We were in the same Slack group, and he said, you'll never believe what happened. I just made the observation, and it turned into this amazing conversation. It turned out it had nothing to do with playing video games. It was like this thing that happened in this other department, and he was being pulled into this project, and he wasn't clear about what the objectives were. And so just by making the observation, he opened up a whole other conversation about something that his teammate wanted to talk about but didn't know how.
That's great. We're going to dive into, I have so many follow-up questions about the mechanics. Jerry's going to take over that in a second. So we're going to unpack why that works, what happened, what's the magic that was a part of that whole conversation. But first off, I wanted to share, I guess, another example that's really in the moment right now and dealing with sort of the context going on with COVID-19, so that people can have that as a frame of mind as we unpack what just happened. So the real situation shared with us by the community was somebody has a direct report who has been exhibiting signs of paranoia about getting sick and has been asking to take time off due to flu-like symptoms. And it's happened a couple times in the last few weeks. This person typically background is a high performer, generally ambitious, but productivity and engagement have tanked. And what's happened is the managers tried to be supportive and tried to let them know they can rest and recover. But the question is, and the dilemma is, at what point do they start giving feedback about expectations? And what's the best way to approach, like, how do you know if that person's actually sick? And so would love to, Jared, if you want to kick in and help unpack the next step of the accountability dial, would love people to think about that context and see if we can dive into the accountability dial with that frame in mind.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Let's just dive in. I know before we get into the accountability dial, the model, so Jonathan, I want to ask you, why do you think so afraid of giving critical feedback, and what makes it so hard?
Yeah, so to me, there are three primary obstacles to why we avoid or sort of minimize the need to give feedback. And it's fear in some form or another, the myth of no time, I have no time to do that, or resignation. There's no point because it's not going to make a difference. So it's either fear, I don't have time, or I have the perception that I don't have time, which is, I'll call that a myth, or resignation. Well, it's not going to matter, so I'm not going to say anything anyway. So those what I would say would be the three primary reasons why people avoid feedback. And another, with fear, another one is, well, I'm afraid that people won't like me. It's not just I'm afraid because it's uncomfortable or awkward. It's oftentimes, well, I'm afraid because I don't want that person to not like me.
Is it okay for people not liking you as a manager?
It's essential. Yeah, I mean, you can't lead or manage a team effectively if you're running everything from the perspective of I need to be liked, right? You've collapsed as an authority, and it's a lot of things we talk about in the book. Is you have to be willing, if you're going to be in a management or a leadership role in an organization, you have to be willing. It's a vulnerable position, right? Because you have context, you have data, you have obligations and responsibilities that others don't have and may not always understand. You've got to be willing to work on that threshold to not always be like, doesn't mean being mean, right? But oftentimes you're going to be in a position of asking somebody to do something or requiring something that creates discomfort with the people on your team. You have to have some threshold for that.
So that basically means as a manager, you can't hope that you want to be liked, but also you can help effectively people to grow. So you have to pick one. And the right one to pick is take a responsibility to help other people to grow, give the feedback, and not making the goal that people will like you.
Right. I mean, imagine if anybody uses like a Peloton or some piece of whether home, fitness equipment or whatever, if there were classes with somebody who said just pedal as fast as you want. It's fine. Don't do anything that's going to be uncomfortable, right? Like you'd never go back to that class, right? Because they're not pushing you. They're not challenging you to become better. And so the classes, the people that we respond to who have expertise are the people who are a little bit further up the hill, and they're saying, hey, you're going to have to push a little bit to get to where I am, right? And so we know that in other parts of our life. Sometimes we forget that at work.
Yep. And that ties to employee engagement as well, because a lot of people right now, when they work for a company, their goal is to grow, get better. And the way to do that is, as a manager, you are in a position to observe and give feedback and also help. If you don't do that, well, you're always be nice with people, but eventually people don't feel the room for growth, and then eventually will leave.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Cool. Let's dive into the model, the accountability dial. What is it?
So one of the things that I realized about myself, which maybe some folks can relate to, is my skill set, my subject matter expertise was much more in the business development, marketing, sales, sort of high level product design. But what I realized, the part that I wasn't good at was the people management part. And I was in some fairly senior leadership positions and finding myself struggling with giving feedback, having coaching, and I knew that I wasn't doing a good job. And I started to look around for a model to do this thing called feedback and development. I couldn't find a model that really spoke to me. So I created one for myself, just for my own leadership, to try to get better. And ultimately, it became known as the accountability dial, and I wrote the book about it and all of that. But I was really just trying to find a way to talk with my team about the things that I was seeing, the opportunities that I saw for them to get better in some different way that I just didn't know how to do. And so what I did was create the accountability dial, which is a 5-step process for how to start and manage a conversation with an employee. Yes, you can use it for performance, for correcting something that isn't going well. But the reason why I created the tool this way is it's also for praising and reinforcing the things that aren't going well. It's also for giving feedback to peers. It's also for giving feedback to people more senior. So it's a 5-stage conversation: the mention, the invitation, the conversation, the boundary, and the limit. That doesn't have a lot of lingo. I think most people find it's fairly logical in the approach. It's a way for managers to start and manage conversations so that they don't feel awkward. People don't have to get defensive. It's just, hey, here's what I'm seeing, and you can move step by step through the dial.
When I first read your book and get to know the model, I feel really impressed at how actionable it is to know there's 5 different stages. And especially the mention, which is the first step, is the difference. Like if you know it, you can almost think a lot of scenario you can apply right away. So what is the definition of mention, and what are the signs that you think this is something that you can leverage the mention as a technique to open a conversation? Can you tell us a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So the mention is a short observation, often but not always a question about something you're seeing. So it's the spirit of the mention is, hey, do you have a second? Now, when we're going to talk about in person and also remote, but the spirit of the mention is there's something you're seeing, right? It could be an obvious, work is not up to the quality that you need. It could be an accountability issue. It could be an attitude or approach, right? Doesn't matter what it's about. It's in that spirit of if you see something, say something. That's essentially what the mention is. And the sign that you know that you should use it is when anytime something pops in your awareness of like, oh, that person seems a little disengaged, or, I got that scope of work from them and it seems like it's not very clear, and it's usually really clear when they send me things, or the way that they're responding on that email, they're being really edgy with that person and I don't know why. It's using our power of observations like we talked about at the beginning, and the mention is simply naming or asking a question about something that we're seeing. Could be in any area of the business, anything that's going on in the team, between two people, in a team dynamic, with the product, could be anywhere. Just naming it. And the power of naming is so undervalued in our world. We're so quick to thinking we can't name it until we have a solution. And that's so many of the problems that we create is we think we have to have the solution, and we haven't even asked the question yet. We haven't even made an observation about what we're seeing. And so that's where we can really leverage the mention is anytime. And if you can post it in chat right now, anything that you're seeing, and I can't see all the things you're putting in chat. Well, should I use a mention about that? Should I use them? Yes. My answer is yes to all of those things, because you can't lose, right? If there's something that you're observing, let's say you're seeing something about somebody feeling, you sense they're disengaged or the quality of work, and you name it and you're wrong. Okay, well, then you just learned something about yourself, right? Then you just, oh, wait, that's so interesting. Why did I think that? Oh, I can learn something about myself. It's not, people set up the thing with feedback. Well, I can't give feedback unless I know I'm right. Pointless, right? Like you've missed the whole game. The purpose of feedback is learning. Sometimes it's for your direct report or a colleague. Oftentimes it's for you, right? Like, why did you perceive it that way? What can you learn about yourself? And the purpose of feedback is actually in the second step, which is reflection. Oh, that's so interesting. Why was that the case, right? Why is that person showing up that way? It's all in those questions. That's what feedback is about. It's not to correct a mistake. It's to start a conversation. And the way that we do that is with the mention, because if we don't do the mention, then we end up having feedback conversations that are big and scary, and people feel like it came out of left field and blindsided and like, well, why didn't you say anything sooner? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's very critical to realize that that's a perspective, probably a new perspective you need to have and internalize. The way you look at feedback is not you're picking on people, you make a judgment, but is out of care, out of curiosity. This is the first time I saw this happen. I just noticed it, and tell me more about it, right? And that will open a conversation.
That's right.
I have a follow-up question, because Susan in the chat mentioned, like, when giving feedback, sometimes it can be interpreted poorly. And you talked a little bit about how the mention is a great way to do that. And the spirit of feedback is about opening up a conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you could apply the mention to avoid getting a negative feedback? Because, like, for example, Jerry will tell you that I'm a pretty difficult person to give feedback to, because I get really defensive, and I get like an angry bear or something when somebody gives me negative feedback. So can you help dive in a little bit deeper into how to avoid?
Yeah. So the thing that I really want to encourage people to do is to invest in the relationship, right? So figure out the OS, if we can use that terminology, like what is the system by which I manage this person? And so, one of the things we work with really early on in our program for managers is, so you set up that relationship. So if I was working with Jerry, if Jerry was my client, I would say, hey, what does it look like when you're giving Patrick feedback, right? Like, when do you typically do that? How does that go? Like, what do you know about Patrick that are like, what are the moments where he's more likely to get defensive? What are the moments where he's more likely to be receptive? So you actually talk about the process for giving each other feedback before you actually do it. So you create the context. Hey, so if I'm Jerry, I would say, hey, Patrick, so I want us to be able to give feedback to one another, not just me giving you feedback, but I also want to, like, how should we do that? Like, let's build a plan together. I know we have our weekly one-on-ones or whatever it is. What are the mechanics? And so when somebody has, a lot of times when people are getting defensive and pushing back, what they're saying to you is, hey, there's no agreement to do this. So I don't know what's happening right now. That's what they're trying to articulate, even though they might not have the words. And so it's that small little investment up front with that person. Hey, here's how I would like to do feedback. And if the accountability dial speaks to you, hey, I want to use this accountability dial tool as our common language. Can we talk about that? Right? And then when you start using it, we're like, oh, okay, I know what's happening. Right? When people are pushing back, it's mostly because, well, I don't know what's happening. I don't know, am I in trouble? Is this punitive? What did I do wrong? Whatever. Is that helpful?
Super helpful. And I definitely appreciate the note of how common language helps overcome the fear of feedback.
I want to continue with the notion Jonathan brought up, which is when you have a coaching agreement, probably the conversation you're going to have is when you first hire someone. It's during the onboarding process. Like, thank you for joining company. And as a manager, this is my goal. I want to help you with the girl. And the way to do that is we need to establish a structure or a agreement that how feedback and when, how, and how often it will be shared. So, and the goal for that is to help you to grow, and it's a bidirectional conversation. I like to hear feedback from you as well. So I think to have that in place is very important. We'll at least get some of the stress out of the way in the very beginning. So another question I have, Jonathan, is for mention, how do you use that towards the early example that Patrick mentioned from the community, that someone have a team member right now, we're in pandemic, and he's very sensitive to his health condition. How do you approach that conversation?
Yeah. So one of the things you'll often hear me do is to break down a situation into its component parts. And I think this is something that we, I think, when I was at the ELC conference last year, we talked about how to tackle organizational debt. And it's I have a similar response, which is, let's take this person's scenario. So there are at least 4 things going on with this person. Right now, there's one conversation. He's struggling in the pandemic, worried about his health, worried about his performance. The manager's worried about performance. There's a lot going on. So there are at least 4 things going on. One, there is the physical reality. Like, is this person sick or not? Do they have COVID-19 or not? Right? I, as their manager, I can't answer that question. Right? But I can use the mention to move that conversation along. Hey, so I sense that there's concern of whether or not you have it or not. Like, is there, I know it's complicated right now, but is there a way that you can get tested, or is there some doctor that you can talk to see if you can get some more comfort there on the actual reality of are you or are you not? I'm supportive of you, doing that. Is that, so that's one element of it, is the physical reality. The second is the emotional response to the physical reality, right? So you can have COVID-19 and have a really calm response to it. You can have COVID-19 and have a really panicked response to it. Like anything that happens in life, different people respond to those stimuli differently, right? So first, what's the physical reality? I can encourage the person to get more information there. I can use the mention to do that. So they don't cycle in, well, I don't know if I have it or not. Okay, well, go get a test, or go go talk to a doctor to learn more about your symptoms. Second thing is the emotional reality. And what we need to be able to do as managers is to say something like, hey, so look, we have this relationship, I am your manager. I want to be as supportive as I can, but, there's at some point here, it seems like this is something you should talk with somebody else about. Do you have a resource in your life outside of work of somebody that you can talk to, a coach or counselor or somebody? Because, I don't want to overstep my role as your manager. And being clear about what that boundary is. You can be supportive and empathic and understand that someone's struggling without going over the line and trying to be their therapist, which you're not qualified to do, and you can only get yourself in trouble, right? So that's the second part. So now we have 2 places where we can use the mention. The third one is the actual performance. Like, are they performing well or not? And oftentimes people don't have a good self-assessment. So we as managers can say, look, I know you have a lot of fear right now, but I just want you to know you're doing really well. Or maybe it's more nuanced. Hey, you're doing really well in these areas, and this area, there's a little bit of room for improvement, but overall, I'm happy, don't worry about that. But then there's the fourth area is the fear of losing my job, right? Or the fear of layoffs, or, I've worked with a lot of companies lately who are doing really well, right? They're seeing a surge in demand, for example, or they're at least stable, but people are really afraid because their friends have lost their job, things are going on in the rest of life. How do I, as a manager, intervene? What can I say, right? And so again, it often comes down to separating what's inside of your control and what's outside of your control. So as a manager, if you say, hey, don't worry, there's not going to be any layoffs, everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it, you're undermining your own credibility, right? Because you don't know that. You can't be sure. Nobody knows right now what the future is going to be. So, but what you can do is you can separate those two things. You can say, hey, look, it's scary. There's a lot going on. I've lost, I know people in my world who've lost jobs as well. So I know there's a lot, and based on everything I know here, things are stable. I'm not saying don't have anxiety. I wouldn't say that to you, but it is what it is. Let's separate that now from, okay, what's actually within your control to focus on? What are the projects that you're working on? Because what happens is people conflate those two things. They say like, I've got fear and anxiety, and then there's work, and it becomes one big mush. And as coaches, managers, leaders, our responsibility is to help people separate those things. Okay, so this is real, and this is real, and this is real. How do we deal with each of those pieces, right? Instead of trying to solve the whole thing at once, which will almost never work.
Great. That's really helpful. How do you find the time? What is the good timing to share that? Like people are busy, right? Especially right now, we're on remote. We don't see people in the office. We don't have the hallway conversation. How do you, the spirit of mention is you do it casually, you bring up the conversation, but now we're all at home. It's like, if you want to have a conversation, do you schedule a meeting? How do you find the time to actually do that?
Yeah. So there are 3 or 4 ways to do this. The first, which I would advise, which frankly I would advise even when you're in office, is reserve the first 1/3 of your one-on-ones for feedback and coaching. So that means if you do a 30-minute one-on-one, the first 10 minutes should be feedback and coaching. And that doesn't mean you lecturing them. It means, hey, let's spend the first 10 minutes talking about what's going on. You probably have some things going on that you want to talk about in your own growth and development. I'll come each week with some ideas of things that I have feedback about. So building that in to the mechanics. And it's really important that you do that first, because if you start with the tasks and the projects, that always bleeds over and takes up all the time. And then the coaching and development always becomes an afterthought. So start with the coaching and development in the first 10 minutes. And so if you've got an hour, that means 20 minutes. So that's one thing. Another thing to do is make sure that you have white space between your meetings. And you should do this anyway. But in terms of overall health, I don't know if anybody here has found themselves in wall-to-wall meetings, Zoom or Teams or whatever you use, wall-to-wall meetings with no time. You don't even have the time to walk from one conference room to another because you're just sitting in front of your computer. That's not good for your physical body. It's not good for your stress levels. And it gives you no time to do this really important thing, like send somebody a Slack message and say, hey, when this meeting's over, can I call you for a minute? I want to chat with you about something. If you don't build 10 minutes in between meetings, right? And an hour meeting can always be 50 minutes. Frankly, an hour meeting can always be 20 minutes if you're disciplined enough. But an hour meeting can always be 50 minutes. So bake those moments into your calendar so that you have the opportunity. And then the third thing, which there's some really interesting data out there now about people using the phone for phone calls more than we have in like the last 10 years, pick up the phone. Call this person, have a human conversation with them. You will be shocked at the result. I know we're so entrained to text these days, to text or Slack or whatever tool we use. We're so used to trying to accomplish everything digitally. And this goes to the no time piece. You spend so much time that you're not tracking, so much time trying to manage performance through ineffective methods like through Slack and email and Asana and whatever tools you use. We're constantly trying to manage performance all the time. We're using so much time and cognitive load on that. And if we just had a 5-minute conversation, right? But we would change it. And this happens this is like the story of my life, is trying to get somebody to have a 5-minute conversation. They go and have the 5-minute conversation. They're like, oh my God, I should have done this 6 months ago. This was so great. We got into it right away. And it was a little edgy at first, but it was fine. And we ended up talking about something really important, right? So that's what I'd say is use the phone, pick up the phone. And lastly, on all of those things, use your first half of your one-on-ones, your time in between meetings and the phone to praise and talk about the good stuff, at least as much as you want to give critical or constructive feedback. You got to keep those things in balance. If every time you send somebody a Slack message to call you back after a meeting and they know it's going to be bad news, you've blown it, right? It's got to be balanced between those two.
Totally. Speaking about using the phone, it's very effective. And a time ago, like I made the way I deliver feedback to say Patrick was terrible I sent him a text message without out of context. Yeah. So how do you feel, Patrick, back then?
I was absolutely furious. I think I steamed for 3 hours about how mad I was with the feedback.
Yeah.
And then we had a conversation over the phone in 5 minutes. It's more effective than just texting Slack, and just pick up the phone, and it's short and quick.
Yeah. I did it once in the Chicago airport. I had just gotten off a plane and I was rushing to get in a lift, and I texted somebody feedback. It was a couple of years ago, and I was like, "Oh, you dumbass. Like, why did you do that?" And of course they were, there was no context. And I think this is another really important thing. And this goes a little bit more into transparency is, as the manager, remember, when you've set an expectation or you've communicated some objective or whatever, it's always more clear in your head than it is for the person receiving it. And there's a really important reason why. It's not because you didn't communicate it. It's because the person that you're communicating it to wasn't in the meeting that you were in where all the context was given, right? They weren't part of the discussion. They haven't been thinking about this in all the ways you've been thinking about it. So your communication might be fine in content, right? The data is accurate, but they don't have the context that you have. So you've got to work harder to do that. And the same goes with feedback. That's why, I was working with a CEO once, and he said, well, I gave them feedback. And I said, well, how did it go? And he said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I sent them a Slack message. And I said, well, how do you know that your feedback was received? And he said, well, I didn't hear anything back. I said, okay, well, so that's an interesting conclusion that you're making there. And then of course the light bulb went. He was like, oh, wait, right. Maybe that doesn't mean that they received the feedback and they agreed with it. Maybe there was a different response. I said, yeah, maybe. So yeah, Slack, text, message, it's all wonderful. Do this stuff in person. There's a reason why the holy grail for salespeople for 100 years, well, at least since the invention of the telephone and sales calls, is getting somebody on the phone. Because when you're actually talking with a human being, some other things that are happen in the relationship building domain that are pretty important.
Right. So it's helpful to know the mention model. Assume that conversation happened, you casually mention something to your employee about something you observed, but after the conversation, things does not get resolved. You keep seeing similar things happening. So yes. What's the next step?
Yeah, so the second step in the accountability dial, what we call the invitation, is to pick up the breadcrumb, right? So you made a mention, hey, I noticed this thing. And then let's say the person said like, oh yeah, I saw that too. I'm going to work on that, right? Let's say they acknowledge it. And then you say, okay, I'm going to let it go for the moment. What we often do as managers is we let it go forever, right? We think saying it once is enough, and it typically isn't, right? When it comes to coaching, we have to reinforce feedback. We have to add different nuance or context, right? Hey, so in that situation, you did this and we talked about it, but we actually didn't talk about it in this other situation. It's the same issue, but it showed up differently, right? And so that's often the place where the invitation will come in, that second step, to say, hey, we talked about this the other day after that Zoom meeting. There's a couple of other things that I noticed, and I think that they might be connected. I think it may be part of a pattern. Are you noticing that? Can we talk about that? Right. And so it's that next step. Oftentimes what I'll say is, if you looked at a company culture or a team culture, if you looked at it with, X-ray vision, you would see 1 million started feedback conversations, and you would see very few conversations actually followed through to the next logical step, which is, hey, we talked about that. Can we keep talking about it? Right. So that's that second step. And that's that pivot into how you bring it into one-on-ones and the third stage of the conversation. The key thing about the invitation is we are very good at seeing patterns of behavior in other people. We are very poor at seeing those patterns of behavior in ourselves. We need our manager to say, hey, it wasn't just a one-off. I'm not mad. It's not the end of the world. You're not fired. But there's a couple of things that I'm seeing, and I think they might be connected, or I have a theory as to why they might be connected. What do you think? And that's a gift to somebody to help them reflect and say, oh, wait a second, I hadn't realized that. I hadn't thought about it in that way.
Yep. And what is the signs of, you are doing that? What are the signs that it's working? So I know I'm doing well in the invitation stage.
Do you see change? It's that simple. Do you see change? Like, if you give feedback and the behavior doesn't change, your feedback was ineffective. Doesn't mean it was wrong. It just means it didn't work. So you got to keep going, right? And so you have to trust in the outcome, right? So if you give somebody feedback, if you try a mention and the behavior doesn't change, and we got to talk about what we mean by that, then that means you have to revisit that conversation. The only wrong move is like, oh, well, I gave feedback. I guess they're not going to change, right? That's the only wrong place we go in our mind, instead of saying, hey, wait a second, maybe I need another conversation. Maybe I need to say it a little differently. Maybe I need to ask a different question, right? We operate in a really inefficient way generally when it comes to feedback, is we approach it in a very binary way, and it's not binary. Human beings don't grow that way.
Yeah.
Let me just say one other quick thing is, if you think about your own feedback conversations, often we have the expectation, well, they need to change this behavior, but it's actually not true. What we're looking for is progress. We actually don't have the expectation that somebody's going to completely do a 180 on something overnight. We have the expectation, an understandable expectation, that they're working on it. And if they're working on it, we're going to exhale. We're going to go, okay, they took the feedback seriously. I can't expect them to change this overnight, but they're working on it. Good. That's the up check we're looking for. It's really important to remember that to be clear in ourselves of what are we actually looking for when it comes to giving feedback in most cases.
Totally. Another thing I think to mention is, when you do the invitation stage conversation, it's an invitation. So you ask people whether you first ask people for the permission to have that conversation first, before actually diving that. I notice things are happening not just once, but there's a pattern. That's after you get agreement from another person that it's okay to have, yes, I want to have this conversation.
Yep. That's right.
Cool.
And you can invite them, right? So one of the ways to conclude a mention is, hey, I don't actually need an answer right away. I'd actually just love for you to think about this. Can we talk about it in our next one-on-one? It's not urgent, right? If you can send the message to people by building this relationship of how we do feedback on growth on our team, whatever's happening in the larger company that you work in, for the moment, I don't care. It's your team, it's your leadership, what's within your control. You can create an environment on your team where you do feedback in a really thoughtful, methodical, and caring way, right? And so by using the mention and the invitation and saying, look, I don't need an urgent response from you. Because if you demand, or if you energize with your tone or the way that you carry yourself, that you need an immediate response, you're going to get an immediate response, and it's going to be a bad one, right? It's going to be someone getting defensive or making excuses or playing victim, because it's like your parents saying, like, have you done your homework yet? Right? You're going to get a response. It's not going to be a very thoughtful one. So why bother, right? Like, use the feedback model, the mention, the invitation, conversation. You're moving the conversation along. If you're trying to close it and end it, it will end, but it won't be with a productive result.
How do you apply that to the early example we talked about? The example that where a manager have a team member that they're might be oversensitive about the pandemic, and they want to ask a lot of sick leave. How do you apply the second stage of the conversation, the invitation, in that example?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would offer is, it's really important to, like, if you think about crisis management or PR, right? If there's a crisis, if there's something that's going on, a good PR person is gonna advise you. They're not gonna say, oh, you should pretend it's not happening, right? They're gonna advise you. There's a phrase in PR, wear it around your neck. Hey, yes, we're aware of it. We've received the emails. We're acknowledging. We're doing some thought. We'll be back to you later with a response, right? You bring it close to yourself, right? So when it comes to something like a pandemic, trying to convince the person that they shouldn't be sensitive or they shouldn't be worried or they shouldn't have anxiety is going to backfire because they've already communicated to you that they are sensitive and they are feeling anxiety. So the way that you counteract that is you take a lower footing, right? So you go underneath them and you say, hey, I'm getting the message. I get that you have a lot of anxiety and I understand that. Like, how can we have a conversation about that? Like, is it something that we can talk about, right? By you going, instead of trying to talk them out of it, you say, hey, I get it, right? And oftentimes just by you being willing to have the confidence to say, hey, I'm willing to talk about that, right? Like, I'm right here. By you being willing to do that, that alone will de-escalate. And they will be able to, and they will say like, oh yeah, I mean, I didn't realize, I thought you were going to just tell me to work harder and that I shouldn't worry about it. I really appreciate having the space to just talk about it. It's, sometimes I have moments where I'm really panicked about it and sometimes I feel fine. Okay, great. Yeah, me too. Right? So it's like by going underneath it rather than trying to fight, if you find yourself fighting somebody for ground in a feedback conversation, stop and step back and say, okay, wait, so what's happening right now? I'm trying to convince this person of something that they don't want to be convinced of. Stop doing that, right? And back up and say, hey, I noticed this thing that's happening. This is a form of a mention. Hey, I noticed this thing that's happening is, you've been sharing some anxiety around the pandemic and you're obviously got a lot going on. And I find myself in this position where I'm trying to sort of convince you or talk you out of it. And I don't want to keep doing that. That doesn't seem productive. That's productive. Right? Stopping doing the thing that's unproductive is productive. And that's a step that we can take as managers and leaders. And by the way, as organizational leaders in the same way.
Cool. I have a quick follow-up question, Jerry. The other side of that example, and this was something that was pretty common that was shared ahead of time by the community, was sort of grappling with at what point do you have the performance conversation in this particular situation? Do you have any insights about how or when to approach that?
Yeah. So you got to make the and, right? So, and we can get into some nuance here as needed, but I'm going to start with that conversation with the human being in front of me, right? Because nothing's going to go well if I don't acknowledge and try to be empathic to some degree of the person in front of me, the struggles they're facing, and I'm going to acknowledge that. And then I'm going to try to make an and. I'm going to say, look, so we're talking about this, and I know that it's not totally resolved. And my job as a manager is to manage the performance of this team and to achieve these outcomes. And those two things are sometimes in tension, right? But we got to be able to talk about both of those things at the same time. Is that okay? Can we do that? Right? And again, that permission, like, of course, right? Anybody who's at all in a place to be able to actually functionally work is going to say, yes, I totally understand. We've got to be able to do both. Okay, great. Thanks. So how can we do that? How do we have a conversation where we're acknowledging that it's difficult for you right now, that there's things going outside of work and there are outputs that you're responsible for? Talk to me about that. How does that live for you, right? And don't, as the manager, think that you have to solve that. Well, here's what you need to do, and blah blah blah. Like that's not gonna work, right? Just by acknowledging, hey, so we need to have two conversations at the same time. We can do this. We're amazing human beings. We can do this. We can talk about the personal situation and we can talk about the performance. And we can do that in every one-on-one. Okay, does that sound good? Great, let's do that, right? And those are the pieces there. And then so there's a couple other important things. Again, this depends on the organization you're in and what the guidelines are, but you probably, in most organizations, you have the ability to say to somebody, hey, maybe you need some time. Totally get it, completely understand. Like maybe it would just be helpful. One of the things I've noticed with a lot of people, nobody's taking vacations right now, right? In the last couple of months, nobody's taking, maybe just a day away would be really good to recharge. What do you think? You know what? That's so, I didn't think we were allowed to take any days off right now because of the pandemic. Like people come up with all sorts of reasons. Like how many people on this call have taken a day off, right? In the last 6 weeks or a week off, right? Mostly if you had a vacation, you canceled it, right? 0 days off, right? So lots of people, we just sort of woke up and we're like, oh my God, nobody is taking any days off right now. So ask this person, hey, maybe you just you need to take a day. Like, why don't you just or take 2 days? Like, fine. Hey, you know what? Me too. I realize I haven't taken any days off either. Right? So nice. I saw someone said I took 2 days off to set an example. Awesome. Good job. I don't see all the comments as they're coming through. So if I didn't respond to yours, it's only because I didn't see it. So that thing, right? If you're constantly working and you're sending emails all weekend long, you're contributing to the pandemic, right? You're doubling down on that fear, and you're basically saying like, hey, there's no clarity, there's no plan, all those kinds of things. So.
Great. I know we only have 30 minutes left. Well, Jonathan, I do want to go through all the other stages of the model. So can you walk us through those?
Yeah. So we talked about the mention. So that's that hallway moment or the Zoom moment. Hey, do you have a second? We talked about the invitation, which is the second step, which is, hey, there's a couple of things that I'm seeing. I think they might be connected. Can we talk about that? That's the invitation. The next step is what we call the conversation. The conversation will typically happen, especially if you're remote, it's going to probably happen inside of a one-on-one, which is, hey, we've been talking about this thing, sort of on a one-off basis, like in the hallway, virtual or real. I'd love to spend a little more time going deeper on this theme. So, we've been talking about you struggling with feeling distracted and like it's really hard to focus. Can we get into that a little bit more? Like, what is the impact that that's having, right? And you're going to start asking some questions of them, like, what impact is that having? And especially during the pandemic, what I'm going to tell you is, you need to be more disciplined with your team to delete, de-escalate, and deprioritize unimportant things. You must do this. It is not realistic to expect human beings who have never worked from home and who've never lived through a pandemic to do both of those things at the same time and perform at the level that they were 2 months ago. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen in any sustained way. So that's how you approach the conversation is, hey, I get it. You show up as, I get it. Two things that have never happened before. One, you've never worked from home before. Well, maybe not both for every person, but for a lot of people, you've never worked from home before, and you've never lived through a pandemic, right? There's 4 or 5 people on planet Earth who've lived through, Spanish flu and this one, right? So I get it. Now let's talk about the impacts. What's going on? Show me the world through your eyes. And what you will find if you don't ask, you won't find out, is that they will tell you they are struggling to focus. It's not that they don't want to work hard. It's not that they don't want to perform at a high level. It's that the number of switches in their brain that are typically overloaded in our already busy world are on hyperdrive right now. I saw somebody say, like, I'm taking Friday off to rest my noggin, right? Like, it's overwhelming. The amount of information everybody in this community, you're really smart. You want to stay informed. You're reading all different sorts of articles. You probably read more in the last 30 days than you did in the year before that. So much going on. The conversation, that third step is, okay, what are the impacts so that you can take ownership of this? You, the employee, wow, I realize I'm trying to do 6 things at once and 4 of them are really struggling. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Manager, would it be okay if I really focused on these couple of things right now for the next? Yes, that would be awesome. That's the highest priority thing for you right now. I'm not worried about the other thing. That can wait until May, right? That clarity, the decluttering, the helping people prioritize in that conversation step. But it happens by you asking them questions about what are the impacts, right? When you feel distracted or disengaged, or it doesn't feel good, right? So by my manager kind of asking me some questions, then I can go, wait a second, I don't actually like where I am either. I want to do some changing. Rather than my manager telling me stop being distracted, or you've got to focus, or you need to work harder. That doesn't work for most human beings. Okay,
yeah,
so
a lot of times the undesirable behavior for a given person in a team is not that they have the wrong intentions, that they don't have the awareness of the impact.
That's right. Yeah. And, we've been talking about, I know ELC, part of the genesis of ELC is hey, these skills are critical for everybody, and engineering leaders have a unique place in a lot of organizations. These skills, I think one of the things we're going to look back on is say all the things that, L&D folks have been talking about and organizations have been increasingly talking about developing people, about the importance of feedback and coaching. It's even more now, right? It's even more. And it's not because people have ill intent. You'll go through your whole career as a leader. You might come across 2 or 3 people in managing 1,000 people who come to work trying to cause problems. Most people are really good. They want to help. They want to contribute. They want to add value, but they're missing a piece of context. And you spending 2 minutes with them can really help. So that's the conversation. The fourth step in the conversation is the boundary. And the way that I teach the boundary is I'll ask, Patrick and Jerry, give me an issue of a piece of performance, of something that you've seen on a team that you've managed where there was a piece of behavior that wasn't good. What was the behavior?
the quality and the consistency of quality for someone managing in the past, that they're just not helping the team.
Okay.
And it caused problems like other team members or clients.
Okay. So Jerry, I'm going to ask you a question. That person is exhibiting that behavior. They're not helping. They're counterproductive to the team. And I'm going to offer you an option. They can be on your team behaving at that level for the next 10 years. How does that sound?
It's not acceptable.
How about 5 years?
That's too long.
How about 1 year?
I think it might be okay, but I'm still will be anxious.
Okay. So now how about 90 days?
That sounds reasonable.
Okay. So somewhere between 90 days and a year, that's your boundary, right? And it's important to articulate that boundary, right? That's the whole purpose of accountability and ownership, is to be clear with somebody. Hey, here's where you are. Here's where I want you to be. And I hope you will also want to be. Here's what it looks like to be helpful of your teammates, whatever the substance of that conversation is. And to talk with that person and say, hey, what do you feel like is a reasonable time frame to make dramatic improvement in this area? And if they say, oh, I think I can work on that over the next 5 years, you're going to say, not good enough. But if they said to you, hey, I feel like that's something that I really struggle with, but I feel like over the next couple months, if I really focus on it, I could get really better, you're going to be happy with that, right? Or at least you will accept that. You're going to say, okay, I can work with that as long as but that's your boundary, right? But oftentimes what managers do is the boundaries forever slides, right? We never actually articulate it. And we have this like perpetual 180-day boundary, but we never actually say that the clock started, right? So to articulate with this person, hey, we've been having this conversation, invitation, conversation, and asking them, hey, so we've been working on this around this theme, whatever the theme is for this person, what's a reasonable boundary? That's the fourth step. Ideally, it's authored by the person, but if you have to co-author it or author it, fine. That's part of being a manager. That's part of being willing to be the one to create a situation that might have some discomfort. That's the fourth step. And then the fifth step is what we call the limit, which is the ability to say, hey, look, I feel like I've done everything I can do as a manager. I feel like I've offered all the coaching that I know how to offer. And I'll say two things about that. One is managers usually overestimate how much feedback and coaching they've actually given. And if you go into exit interviews, if you've ever sat in an exit interview and you ask the employee, they'll say things like, I never got any feedback. Well, I was never really given a chance. And the truth lies somewhere in between, right? They were given some feedback and coaching, but not as much as the manager thinks they were given. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. So index on the side of giving more feedback, more coaching. Start with the assumption that you're not giving as much as you think you are. You're not giving as clear coaching as you think you are. You haven't given it as much time. And the other thing is just that limit of that's self-care as a manager. If you have a team of 10 people and you're coaching and managing 6 people with mediocre or poor performance, you're creating so much work for yourself. The purpose of the accountability dial is not to achieve human perfection with all 10 of those people, but it's to start to move people from where they are to get better, right? And the purpose of the limit is oftentimes that's what we need. The last thing I'll say, that's often what we need as human beings. We need to know that there's a limit, right? We need to know that I don't have forever to make a change. Hey, I feel like I'm out of options. Okay? And that can be the most productive moment. That can be a career-changing moment for somebody, for a manager with the guts to say, hey, look, I don't know what else to do here. You got to find some other gear. You got to, I don't know, go talk to your brother, your sister, go think about this. I don't know what else to do. I feel like we've had all these conversations and it's not that you're not trying, but it's not changing. And I don't know why. And if you've invested and built that relationship and you've got trust, then they'll go, holy crap. I know this person has my best interest at heart. What am I missing? And they may find some other gear. And if they don't, well, then they're probably not in the right job or in the right stage of their career to be a high performing member of your team right now. That's okay too. Teams change, people move around. Maybe they're not inspired by the product anymore, whatever, doesn't matter. But by you having the conversation, mention, invitation, conversation, boundary, and limit, you create this cycle on your team where people are showing up with their best and they're making those small improvements, and you'll feel so much better about life as a manager, and you'll have so much more time because people are owning their stuff.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to transition to some rapid fire Q&A in just a second. There've been a couple questions about how do I continue on with the accountability dial. Jonathan has a PDF. We're going to include that in the follow-up email. So if you're like, well, what are all these steps? We'll send you the PDF. But Jonathan, could you give just a quick recap of the accountability dial and then maybe share how people can continue to get involved, to learn, to apply, and to deepen their expertise within this framework?
So we're on a mission to get the accountability dial in the hands of 10 million managers in the next 10 years. The easiest way that you can do that is go to academy.refound.com. We have a video course. It's $97. You can go, you can sign up, and you'll interact with a human being. There's the Refound team. The Academy team is there to help you both learn and implement the steps in the accountability dial. So it's just academy.refound.com or just refound.com, and you'll see the button for the video course. That's the easiest way. And then we'll help you roll it out with your team if that's something that's of interest.
Great. And can you recap the 5 steps?
Yes, the mention, the invitation, the conversation, the boundary, and the limit.
A couple of quick questions that are coming in. So Justin asked us a question about how do you use the accountability dial to give positive feedback. Mm-hmm. So, and I know that you've mentioned to Jerry and I a couple times some examples of that, but I think for now, a lot of people are dealing with challenges with morale. How do you use the accountability dial to increase morale or give positive feedback?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think we forget to do is reinforce the people who are doing well, right? So people who are really focused right now, and reinforcing that. So in a one-to-one basis, I would say, hey, I know we've got a lot going on right now. I just want you to know, like, I noticed like how focused you are, and I noticed how you've been picking up the slack, and I really appreciate that, right? That's a mention, right? So the architecture is the same, right? And then as you see somebody, right, you're seeing the best of people and the things that they struggle with right now. That's what happens in a crisis. People respond differently. Some people go calm, centered, grounded. Okay, this is what's within my control. And other people freak out. And it doesn't make them one good person and bad person, but using the accountability dial to reinforce, or with your team. Hey, everybody, I just want to say, like, the tone of our stand-up this morning was really different. It felt like there was kind of a positive vibe. And I know that doesn't change. There's still a lot going on, but I really loved how proactive everybody was this morning. That's a mention that you can use. You don't have to solve anything. You don't have to fix anything. Just noting it and naming it is so powerful.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question. This is something that's been talked about a lot in the chat, actually. So somebody was sharing a story about how they're struggling to get a one-on-one with their manager, and so people have shared some good solutions. But one of the big questions in the Q&A was about how do you create an environment of bidirectional feedback? So as an engineer to a manager, how could you give feedback that way, or create the environment to make that possible?
Yeah. So let's just flip that on the head of what we talked about earlier. So if as a manager, one of my strategies that is important is I got to build that relationship. I have to set that context. If I'm in the more junior position, then I'm going to ask for it, right? I'm going to say, hey, in my own learning and development, it's really helpful for me to get feedback. And I'd love for that to be two-way. I've had many people say, hey, like, is it just, can I give you feedback? And hopefully you work for someone who says yes, right? If you work for someone who says, no, I'm not interested in your feedback, well, you probably already started to look for another job. But that's what I would say is I would ask and say, look, it would be really helpful, especially nowadays. It's really important for me that I get some consistent time in your calendar. When would work for you, right? And I've been counseling multiple people, especially key engineers, and with a couple of our clients. I said, look, it sounds like you need more time right now with the CTO. Yeah, I do. Okay, go and ask for it, and don't say like, hey, I need an hour of your time. Say, I need 7 minutes once a day. Can we do that? Right? Like, yeah, great. Can we do it when I'm on my way, when I'm going for my morning walk or whatever? Like, you got to loosen the boundaries a little bit to accomplish that, especially, during this time. I've got things happening at 11 o'clock at night and 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is, right? It's, all bets are off right now. We got to solve the problems that are in front of us. So, within reason, within your organization and those rules, but I would ask for it and say, this is really important for me. And then, we can do a whole separate conversation of how you use the accountability dial if you don't get what you need there, of how you escalate that accountability, but we don't have time for that today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So as a reminder, if you're looking to get more involved with Jonathan's work in the accountability dial, feel free to visit academy.refound.com, and we'll send that in a follow-up email as well. But to close, I would just like to say, moments like this are why our community exists. And in times of great challenge, it's the people, it's the peers, and it's the knowledge sharing in forums like this that help us tackle greater challenges faster and together and meet the leadership demands of the moment. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope you are able to open up conversations that matter. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody, for all your great questions.